Story 1. I was on the West Coast and had my first professional job that required me to get to the office at 6 a.m., which was right after the first plane hit. It was a strange evolution of thoughts. My first thought was that it was a small aircraft or something similar. Even back then, it wasn't uncommon for it to be reported that a small plane had landed on the freeway, so I figured it was something like that. Then it was clarified that it was a jetliner. I still didn't know what to make of it. Someone in the office managed to get the live feed up, but I still wasn't sure what the big deal was. It was a terrible accident, but why were we watching it? Then the plane hit the second tower, and we thought it was a replay of the first impact, but then we saw smoke coming out of both towers. So what was going on? Slowly, it dawned on us, the news anchors and everyone everywhere, that this wasn't a freak accident. It was a coordinated attack of some kind. And then it got surreal. Story 2. I was in the military for 8 years on September 11th, and my sister worked in the Pentagon. She had a dental appointment that morning. She would have been right in the middle of everything had she been at work. I was angry and upset. Then, it was even worse when the government decided to invade Iraq despite evidence showing it was Al-Qaeda operating in Afghanistan and Iran. It was a terrible and awful day. I still have post-traumatic stress disorder from witnessing the towers and people jumping to their deaths. Story 3. I was in my sophomore art class. We usually had the television on while we worked on our projects. At the time, I didn't understand the significance of the situation, but it felt like the world had stopped turning for several days. Story 4. I arrived at work late, as usual, and the human resources representative sneaking the smoke by the front door told me that a plane had flown into the World Trade Center, and then a second one had flown into the other tower. All I could think of was that episode of The Lone Gunman. On the way up the elevator, I figured it might be some sort of glitch in the automatic pilot. In the studio lobby, I saw the receptionist was crying. No work got done that day. Televisions were wheeled out between the cubicles, and everyone stayed glued to the screens until long after quitting time. Later, a few of us went to see the movie Amelie. Story 5. I watched the first tower fall from a Brooklyn rooftop. It was surreal. I was frozen in place for a few minutes but moved inside once it started raining thick ash and debris. The reality of what I witnessed began to hit me a few days later. I was 14. Story 6. I was in the United States Navy stationed out of Norfolk, Virginia, on the USS Ramage, DDG-61. I was in a navigation course at the time when a fellow sailor came in talking about the first plane impact. We started watching the news and saw the second plane hit. We were immediately told to return to our ship. Another sailor and I drove 120 miles per hour back to the ship, even passing police without issue. We then heard about the Pentagon, and it all felt surreal. We got underway with about a sixth of our crew and were the first ones out. We went straight to Washington, D.C. for the first night, and the next day traveled to New York to provide air coverage. We probably worked for nearly 2 days straight because so few people were on board. They ended up sending our crew out on helicopters. We stayed out for about 2 weeks before heading home and preparing to deploy. Every moment of that day is seared into my memory. One thing that still haunts me is the sight of people jumping to avoid burning to death. Story 7. Born and raised in New York, I had just moved out of the city. I had family and friends who worked at Chase Bank and American Express, both across the street from the towers, and a few more working in other buildings in the area. I knew someone at Cantor Fitzgerald and had interviewed for a job there, which I did not get. I had freelanced at Solomon Smith Barney in Building 7 for a few months right before I left. I watched the second plane hit from a television in the lobby while at graduate school. What I remember most was the fear. I didn't know how many people I knew were dead. And while it was happening, no one had any real sense of where the next plane was going to crash. It felt like every city in the country could be next. I remember someone entering the lobby yelling that they just hit the Sears Tower. This turned out to be false, but we did not know that at the time. It was also surreal because prior to this, there had been no large-scale terrorist attack in the United States apart from the Oklahoma City bombing, which was not comparable. Felt like watching a movie, only it was real. The sight of people jumping out of windows on live television was particularly horrifying. I felt guilty for not being home. I just wanted to return to my city. I couldn't stop watching the footage on television. It took me hours to finally cry. It took years to get used to not seeing those buildings when I would go home. They had been there my entire life. Story 8. It was terrible. I was confused about which city I was looking at since I hadn't woken up until after both towers fell. I then called my friend's mother because he worked in Tower 1, and I drove to a spot where I watched the smoke and fighter jets overhead. The stench was horrendous. Story 9. I was in primary school in England when the head teacher interrupted the class, wheeled in an old television, showed the footage, and then we had a moment of silence. At the time, I was 9 years old and had no idea what really happened or how to process it. The mood was depressing. Story 10. I was in high school, and the thing that stands out in hindsight is how little we knew about what happened. The term terrorism was not really in common use at that time. We had no idea who was responsible, what occurred, or why it happened for several days. Story 11. I was 21 and living in Oregon at the time. I had just gotten up and was getting ready for work when my roommate called me to the living room to watch a breaking news report about a plane hitting a building. I was in shock and confused as I saw the second plane hit. Realizing I was late for work, I rushed to get there. When I arrived, they were holding an employee meeting and dismissing everyone for the day. When I got back home, I drank heavily while watching the news. Story 12. I was in school when they stopped class and asked, "Do any of you have family that work in New York?" In a fun way, everyone who raised their hand was shuffled into another room. I remember feeling disappointed that my family only worked in Philadelphia, so I didn't get to go. I stayed in school the whole day because my mom worked there, but most people were picked up early. My mom rushed me out at the end and told me what happened, and I went home and watched it. I wasn't afraid because I was young, but my mom was. One of the kids in that room had a family member who died. Story 13. It was when my memory first started to activate, and this memory remains vivid to this day because that is when I realized the world does not play fair and that it is a very ugly game. Story 14. I was in Rio de Janeiro, in my living room. I was 17 and didn't have classes that morning. I was watching cartoons when the first tower was hit. It took me a while to realize it was a real terrorist attack and not an excerpt from a movie. Even after realizing it was real, I didn't give it much thought. Story 15. My ex-husband and I worked in Manhattan. I was in the garment district across the street from the Empire State Building while he was on Wall Street. I arrived at Hoboken train station right after the first plane hit. I was dozing and woke up to the entire train car gasping at the sight of the huge hole in the first tower. I remember looking at it and thinking that people had died there, and I just couldn't believe it. By the time I reached the city, the second tower had been hit, and we knew it was an act of terrorism. My husband called me and told me that everyone was leaving and trying to get off the island. He suggested that I walk to the ferry to leave the island. After the towers fell, there was no cell service because the cell tower was on one of the towers. It took hours to get home, but I arrived before my husband. I remember thinking that night about how many people were lying in empty beds on the other side. I knew I was incredibly lucky. Story 16. I was living in Brooklyn and watched the news like everyone else after a bike messenger told me. They hit the World Trade Center. I desperately called my brother, who was working in Lower Manhattan, and he was fine. I called several other people until the phones stopped working. Then I received many calls from my friends in other parts of the world. Later, I crawled up to the roof of my building and watched the remains of the towers burn. I stood there in the direct path of the smoke and probably inhaled things I shouldn't have. Story 17. I was at work. My boss had us all leave early because the atmosphere was disorienting. I went home and watched TV, feeling numb. Story 18. I still remember seeing the smoke for days from my college campus. The continuous news coverage was not helpful. I experienced nightmares. Story 19. On the other side of the continent, I was scheduled to sign an investment contract with a small aerospace company that afternoon, which was intended to be my springboard to complete financial independence. That deal never materialized, and my life took a very different turn. It worked out in the end, but the following years were really challenging. Although it was not comparable to what others experienced in New York, the impact was felt everywhere. Story 20. I was about to turn 25 and was living in Boston with my fiancée. I got to work, and my best friend sent me an instant message saying a plane had hit each of the towers. I pictured small planes and some sort of freak accident for a moment until she explained it to me. Then someone in the office turned on the TV, and everyone started talking at once. A moment later, it hit me that my younger brother, in his first post-college job, was working in one of those buildings. I tried calling him but couldn't get through. I called both my parents in a panic, but no one could reach him. I thought he was gone. I watched the towers fall on TV with my office mates, and then they let me go home. I think my fiancé picked me up. I remember just staring at the TV in our small apartment. My brother called me a few hours later, having walked across the Brooklyn Bridge to safety. He was evacuating the second tower when it was hit and was close enough to the ground floor that he got out and away before it collapsed. Story 21. I was living in Tokyo when a typhoon got reasonably close to the city that day. This occupied the first 10 minutes of the 10 p.m. news, after which they cut over to their New York correspondent. The initial report indicated that a small plane had collided with the first building. Given that the buildings had previously been bombed, it felt intentional. It was before the widespread use of voice over internet protocol, so I took a quick ride home to call my mom on the US West Coast from my landline. The second attack occurred while I was on my way. She was already awake and had seen the news. I knew it was going to be bad. The president was untrustworthy. The Patriot Act and the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, among other things, were direct results of the events of September 11th. The misinformation surrounding the Iraq War was misleadingly tied to those events. Now it seems that much of the machinery created in response to September 11th is going to be turned against Americans. Story 22. It was quite jarring, especially when it became apparent that more than one aircraft was involved, ruling out an accident. It was clearly an act of terrorism, which made the situation very ominous. On a personal level, I sighed and silently acknowledged that as a reservist who had recently completed 8 years of active service, I would be called up, and I was. It was truly a pivotal moment in my life and my family's life. Story 23. I was at work when the news broke that our city was on the list of targets. Everyone was panicking. We had to close the office and rush home. Thankfully, it turned out we weren't targets after all. Better safe than sorry. It was also my daughter's birthday. Story 24. I was being driven to school after a dentist appointment. I got to history class in middle school and told the teacher. He turned on the television just as the second plane crashed into the tower. The principal ran from room to room yelling to turn the televisions off. As soon as he left, teachers would turn them back on. Story 25. Sat in a law enforcement 911 dispatch center for hours, where the phones never rang. I'm sure the medical side had calls, but we did not. Story 26. Someone else described it as the end of the 1990s. I don't know why this description seems so emotional and precise to me, but it did. I was a senior in high school, so it was definitely the end of childhood and innocence for me. Story 27. I am British and was 12 when it happened. I didn't find out until right at the end of the school day, and I clearly remember walking up to the car park when one older boy yelled to his friend from across the pathway, "Have you heard half of America has been blown up?" To which the other boy replied, "What do you mean?" The first boy then said, "It's all over the TV in the common room. Come and watch it." I remember thinking that was strange and then getting into my mum's car, which was listening to the radio. She looked ashen, and I remember asking her what had happened. She didn't know how to respond. A few years ago, Mum told me that when she first turned on the radio to pick me up, her first thought was that it was just some drama about the apocalypse due to the DJ being ill or something. I don't remember much else, except when Dad got home, all of us watched the news in shock. Story 28. It was around 10 p.m. My husband and I were awake after a small argument and turned on the television to calm down just after the second plane hit. We quickly forgot about the disagreement. We didn't take our eyes off the screen until 5 a.m. We watched both towers fall and all the horrors in between. The world has never been the same since. It instilled fear in a generation that had lived without war or large-scale catastrophe. The media capitalizing on that fear to drive engagement has made the world a far sadder place. Story 29. I was at home on the computer bidding for collectible Matchbox cars when my partner yelled downstairs to inform me that a plane had hit the World Trade Center. I said, "Yeah, probably some nut in a private plane." She replied, "No, it was a jet with people in it." I flew upstairs and watched the second plane hit before they reported the plane in Washington, D.C. I was horrified and frightened, but I knew I was safe as I lived in very rural Vermont. I called my sister, who was supposed to be on that plane from Boston to San Francisco, but she and her husband had left the day before so they could relax. It was a business trip for him. I was glued to the TV for a week afterward, reaching out to friends in New York City who lived in Brooklyn. One of them said it felt like the end of the world. The sky was full of ash and particles. My son was 3, and we somewhat isolated him in the playroom, watching Blue's Clues and other shows. We ate lunch with him in there and played with him because we couldn't turn off the TV, but we didn't want him to see it either. I am convinced this experience made me hypervigilant regarding the news. I was part of a theater company called Bread and Puppet, and we went down to do a show in October to celebrate the reopening of Battery Park. You could still smell the burnt air in parts of downtown. Story 30. I was teaching when a Korean airliner was diverted to my city, and none of us knew why or if it posed a danger. All schools were evacuated. I drove 3 high school students home and then went to find my husband at his school. I remember watching the plane fly overhead and praying it was just landing at the airport, not bombing or crashing into downtown. At the time, I was teaching a mass media class. The events of September 11th immediately became a significant part of my lessons. We looked at different news approaches, read articles from a variety of sources, and compared the differences. As a city, we learned that having a nearby school serve as the evacuation location for another school, for example, my high school was supposed to evacuate to the elementary school next door in case of emergency, was a disaster. Story 31. I was in college when someone in class said a small plane hit the tower. Not long after, the dean came and told us that class was over and we should go home immediately. From Queens, you could see the towers and the smoke billowing from them. By then, we knew that terrorists were crashing planes, but there was no one to speak with and no immediate information available. Cell phones didn't work and just gave a network error. I remember driving home in a panic, looking up at the sky as I drove. I probably drove 100 miles per hour on the Van Wyck. It's impossible to forget that day. Story 32. My son was in basic training for the United States Air Force. As soon as it happened, I knew that day he would be going to war. The authorities asked them if they still wanted to be an airman and that they could leave now if they wanted. My son stayed. He was in Iraq, Afghanistan, and all the places. He served for 21 years. I lived in fear for years. He was one of the lucky ones. He came home a different person, but he was safe. I will never forget that day. Story 33. Lives in Northern New Jersey. I was a freshman in Italian class when an announcement came over the public address system detailing the situation and advising against changing classes at the bell. Everyone was anxious because many students had parents working there or nearby. School was dismissed early, and my dad, who was off work that day, drove me to Route 17. As we headed toward the city, we could see the enormous column of smoke in the sky. It was surreal. I went home and watched the news all night. My parents didn't make us go to bed. Story 34. I lived in New York City and watched the towers fall. It was like living in a surreal world. On that day, we were all in a daze. People were walking everywhere, some covered in dust from head to toe. There were lines for blocks to donate blood, but there was no one to donate to. Missing person signs started appearing the same day and ended up covering Manhattan for months. We held candlelight vigils and sang Amazing Grace in Union Square. We talked in whispers. Washington Square was filled with chalked messages for peace. Homemade signs for peace hung in windows. I saw the first one that very night. New York wants peace. An eye for an eye makes the world blind was another popular one. Yet, People on the news who didn't even live in the city were calling for blood. For me, it made me a pacifist. I heard the planes hit and they sounded like torpedoes. I saw the towers fall and experienced the aftermath. I couldn't stop thinking this must be what it feels like to have your city shelled, except these were only two buildings. Imagine the whole city getting bombed. I wouldn't wish it on any civilian population. It's horrific. Then to see the president at the time use it as an excuse to invade Iraq, even though the perpetrators were from another country entirely, it was difficult to process. Story 35. British perspective. It was terrifying. I was a teenager old enough to remember life before September 11th, 2001, but young enough to be scared. It was surreal. I had nightmares about being in the planes going into the buildings for weeks afterward. We never imagined the United States to be vulnerable enough to be attacked so intimately, and it opened the world's eyes to such a form of attack. Previously, hijackers had demands for the plane or the hostages. This attack awakened the world to the reality of suicide bombers. With the fall of Enron and the numerous conspiracy theories that followed that horrible day, it still lives rent-free in my mind as a dark day that introduced young me to the idea that everyone should be doubted when it comes to power and money. Story 36. I was living in Brooklyn when I woke up and turned on the television to watch the weather. I saw the live feed of the World Trade Center. The first plane had already hit. My mom called to see if I was okay. We watched television together and saw the second plane. About 15 seconds later, I heard the explosion through my window. Story 37. I was in college in a lecture hall. Our professor was supposed to be on a flight to New York that morning but missed it, so he came in to teach. Midway through the lecture, someone walked out, grabbed our professor, and took him out of the room. He returned about 2 minutes later and told us all, "Something is happening in New York, and you should all go home." It was the most surreal experience walking across a campus of 50,000 students and seeing people huddled in front of televisions. Nobody was out and about. I spent the rest of the day watching television and the news trying to figure out what happened. Story 38. Last month, I took over an apartment from a man who worked at Cantor Fitzgerald. I had the television on in his old place and watched the tower collapse while he was on the roof, hoping for the helicopters to arrive. Story 39. I was in middle school when we were called to the English and social studies rooms to discuss what was happening after the first plane hit. It was a magnet school. The father of a student in my grade worked at one of the twin towers. He started crying and was escorted out. I have no idea what happened to him or his father. We were sent home, and while watching TV with my parents, the second tower was hit. Watching everything collapse and the aftermath was surreal. I remember being in shock the entire day. Story 40. I was in my work van listening to Howard when the first plane hit. He announced that a small plane had struck. That was the only information available. I paused the recording and went to a service call. When the client opened the door, he had the TV on and said, "Do you believe this?" Just then, the second plane hit. We sat there stunned and watched for an hour. He was a former member of the armed forces and said, "A lot of people are going to die today and very soon too." Story 41. I lived in Brooklyn, and the thing that stands out in my mind is a group of friends who all gravitated to a friend's house that night with a backyard. We sat outside, probably a dozen of us, in near silence, just having a beer together. The only time the silence was broken was by the sound of fighter jets flying overhead every 30 minutes to an hour, protecting the city. It was surreal and unsettling. It emphasized that the city had been attacked. Once mass transit was back up, that same silence permeated the subways. When a train would slow down or stop in a tunnel, and worse, when the lights would go out and leave us in darkness, people would look at one another nervously. Story 42. We live on Long Island. It was surreal. It was hard to see people lining the streets with pictures of their missing loved ones, hoping to find their wife, husband, parent, or child. We sent supplies to the volunteers working at Ground Zero. It was the least we could do. Story 43. As I sat there watching the planes hit the towers repeatedly, I turned to some friends and said, "The government will use this as an excuse to strip us of our remaining privacy and civil liberties." Story 44. I was in elementary school in the Midwest, And I remember at lunch we all asked other classes what their teachers told them, as if they all had different or better information. Story 45. I came home from school and saw it on TV while talking with my mom on the phone. The news was on silent in the background, and I thought it was scenes from a movie. Story 46. I was 21 with no skills or redeemable qualities. I hoped we weren't going to be conscripted for World War III and then went back to sleep. Story 47. I was 6 years old and saw it live on the news while leaving for school. I witnessed the second plane hit, and that's all I really remember. Story 48. I was 11 and walking back to the kitchen from my granddaddy's house to get food. I wasn't in school because my dad and stepmom got married on the 14th, and it was out of state, so I was being moved around. Story 49. I was at work at an old gas station, watching it on a 15-inch box television that was placed on top of the cola fridge. I stayed still for a few minutes and didn't look away from the screen for another 15 minutes after the second plane hit. Story 50. My father called to tell me that the first plane hit and that another had struck the Pentagon. I was getting ready for graduate school and couldn't understand why he was calling. I turned on the television just in time to see the second plane hit. I was devastated. For some reason, I proceeded to class. Another plane hit a field in Pennsylvania. They sent us all home, not knowing what was happening. Non-stop news began. We saw the images of people jumping played over and over again. Shock? Just utter shock. Life has literally never been the same. If you weren't alive before, you don't know the sense of blissful safety we had. Story 51. Feelings of overwhelming sadness and helplessness emerged. A group crashed their plane into a field to prevent it from hitting a government target. Due to cell phones, their last words to loved ones could be heard. Planes were diverted to places like Newfoundland, Canada, where it was later shown that large numbers of people took them in and provided housing and food. Watching one of the Twin Towers collapse after a plane hit, it was seemingly impossible to grasp, let alone the other tower. Firefighters and investment bankers were trapped in stairwells. I was in Northwest Indiana, about an hour's drive from Chicago, and it was gut-wrenching. It seemed like an impossible number of bodies would be reduced to ashes with no way to identify them. Story 52. I served in the Marines. Our camp was on lockdown as we prepared to be deployed to New York, Washington, D.C., or overseas within 72 hours. Ultimately, another unit was sent instead, which allowed us to be deployed to Iraq a little later. Story 53. I was getting ready for school and walked up to see my mom asleep on the couch while the first plane struck the tower. I thought it was a new action movie until I got to school, where they kept playing footage of the crash and the second plane hitting on all the school TV screens. I was in 5th grade then. Story 54. I was walking home from primary school when I was 11. I went to a corner shop and saw the first plane hit the building. Everyone was shocked. I bought my sweets and walked home. By the time I got home, I set my bag down, saw the TV, and then the second plane struck. Everyone started wondering what was going on. It felt like the atmosphere changed. They kept repeating the footage on loop on television. My family was visiting from New York, and it took them a couple of extra days to get home. I remember making my brother change the channel from the news because there were new episodes of Sabrina the Teenage Witch that I needed to watch. Story 55. It was really scary because we didn't know if they were going to keep coming. When the towers collapsed, it brought an enormous feeling of sadness. The silver lining was that everyone became united and kind for a short while afterward, but unfortunately, it didn't last. Story 56. In the Navy on deployment, it was September 12th for us. I was woken up and sent to my station to monitor what was happening in various ways. I remember my first break after that, sitting there and thinking about how useless I felt on the other side of the world. Story 57. I was a freshman in high school. For whatever reason, class didn't start until 11:30. I used to watch those reality television shows like Maury in the morning. Then it was interrupted by the news saying the Twin Towers were on fire. I saw the other plane hit. My mom was at work, and we couldn't get through to her. My grandparents sent me to school for whatever reason. While I was in school, I heard that the towers fell. I lived in Queens. I could see the smoke from my house for days. Then they started playing people's last phone calls on the radio. I'll never forget it. Story 58. I was at work, and we gathered around the radios and the computer. It was sad. It was the first time as an adult that I heard my dad cry. Story 59. I was on the West Coast, so it was 6:30 a.m. my time. My television served as my alarm clock, and I woke up to the sight of the first tower burning on the news. I watched the second plane hit live before getting up to go to work. It was my 20th birthday, and we ended up watching the news all day at the office before they allowed everyone to go home. We still had a small birthday gathering at my aunt's house as planned, although it didn't feel much like a celebration. It was comforting to be with family that day. Throughout the day, it didn't really register how serious the situation was. As the news emerged about the death toll, it began to hit home. In 2018, my wife and I visited the Ground Zero Memorial in New York, and we cried the entire time. Our kids didn't fully understand, as it was just something they had learned about in history class. Story 60. I was living in South Africa. After the first plane hit, I remember standing in the lounge with my family, watching the smoke billowing from the side of the building, trying to understand how this could have happened. When the second plane hit, I felt a sense of shock and numbness as I started to realize what was really going on. Felt like the world had suddenly changed. That's the only way I can explain it. I have only felt that twice in my life, once on September 11th and then again when the country locked down for COVID-19. Seeing those bodies falling from the towers in real time was horrific. Story 61. I am a United States citizen, but I was 21 years old and on vacation in Greece, on the islands not far from Turkey. In the afternoon, some fighter jets had flown by, but I didn't pay any attention. At dinner that night, the small restaurant had a television in the corner, and I saw the first tower, but I thought it was likely Beirut or something else. It wasn't in English. A couple from Norway or Sweden told me it was New York, and I was confused and, I guess, in shock. I got to the youth hostel on the island where they had BBC News on and watched the second tower get hit. Then the first one fell. I saw people jumping. It was surreal and horrible. Other Americans showed up there, and we cried and got drunk together. I remember being on a roof at some point with others, amazed by all the stars and feeling weird and sad. Story 62. I had just woken up after driving back from Rehoboth Beach in Delaware. As I crossed the border headed north, I saw the second plane hit in real time. I disassociated, and it took me a moment to accept it. Story 63. I was in my last week of break before my second year of college. I had a Reserve Officers Training Corps scholarship and in 2 weeks was expected to sign my contract. I pursued the Reserve Officers Training Corps from the perspective of growing up in the 1980s and 1990s, believing it would pay for college and provide good training in logistics or intelligence, allowing me to transition to a nice civilian job. It still achieved that, but as I finished school and we entered Afghanistan and then Iraq, I decided I would rather go to war with the toughest individuals and volunteered for every opportunity. I ended up branching into a combat role, and while the end result was similar to my original plan, it took a lot of psychological trauma to reach that point. Story 64. This makes me sound very old. I was a freshman in college when I watched the plane hit the second tower live on television. My college is near where Flight 93 went down. We were all shocked and in a daze. The college canceled all classes for that day and the following day. At Flight 93, they called for the National Guard, and our Reserve Officers Training Corps program went with them, including some friends of mine. They were out of school and camping at the crash site for weeks. It was one of the early days of cell phones, and ours were jammed with so many callers that we couldn't call home. My mother was worried because the news reported a plane went down near Pittsburgh, and all she knew was that I was near Pittsburgh. She couldn't reach me. In my dorm, many people started putting American flags on their doors. I posted a picture of the firefighter raising the flag in New York City. Story 65. I was in Brooklyn on my day off work. Sleeping in on my day off was a sacred thing, so I was surprised when my wife woke me up. She told me that someone had accidentally flown a plane into the World Trade Center. I found this hard to believe. Pilots are trained to ditch in water. There are rivers on either side of Manhattan, and a large bay right there. How could you accidentally hit a building? We were debating this when the second plane hit, ending the discussion. Most cell service and phone trunk lines went through the World Trade Center, so most communications were cut. Trying to reach our families was very difficult. Cable was still working, allowing us to see the horrible news coverage while looking out our window. The smoke was coming straight at Brooklyn, so we soon had to close all windows and hunker down. News anchors were saying, "The smoke is blowing away from Manhattan, out to sea." But guess what's between Manhattan and the sea? Brooklyn. I saw a shirtless man rollerblading down the street in a gas mask. Trying to find out which friends were alive, who was displaced, and who was missing was nearly impossible on the first day. Phone service was spotty. People were walking long distances to escape the smoke and ash. Trains were being rerouted, and planes were grounded. It was pretty intense. Story 66. I watched it from my rooftop on the edge of the East River in Brooklyn. It was the most perfect early autumn morning. Blue skies to the east, a cloud of smoke to the west. Until that moment, the World Trade Center was the landmark you could rely on from almost any neighborhood. There was no more air traffic. Fighter jets were patrolling. There were months of smoke and thousands of missing persons photos on numerous walls. That and the smell. Story 67. It was 2 weeks shy of my 23rd birthday, and I was living in Hawaii. I slept through most of it due to the time difference, but I was woken up by a Scottish friend, whom I struggled to understand during normal hours, who told me what happened. I watched the news for about 2 hours straight, and then I convinced myself that I was about to be drafted to fight in World War III. I paced up and down the street, mentally preparing myself. Story 68. I was in the World Financial Center across the street. I watched the second plane fly into the tower and a giant fireball shoot out the other side of the building. I also saw people jump to escape the flames. Story 69. I was at work in Groton, Connecticut. After the second tower was hit, we watched every submarine from the Navy base sail silently down the Thames River and out to sea. We figured they wanted to get past the Interstate 95 bridge in case it was attacked, but it might have been preparation for war. It was a scary sight. Story 70. I lived in New York at the time, about 40 minutes north of the towers. I was very young and had never heard the word terrorism before. It was really scary. Everyone was pulled from school that day, and we didn't know why, but we were scared of more planes coming. In the months that followed, family and friends volunteered to clean up the city. My dad worked in the city his entire life. He had been laid off a few months before, or he would have been there. My dentist helped identify the remains by their teeth. Watching videos of the towers being hit and falling, and people jumping still gives me chills. I visited Ground Zero last week, and it was the first time being there since then without getting the chills. Story 71. I was in the military at the time, and once we realized what was happening, it was definitely a shocking moment. Bases locked down, people I knew being sent immediately to New York and Washington, D.C. I was stationed on the East Coast, and there were hundreds of questions from family and friends. Story 72. I was working with a group of United States military personnel. 2 of them had previously worked at the Pentagon, right where the plane struck. It was a surreal day. It was also likely the most significant terrorist act ever and has directly led us to our current situation. Story 73. I was commuting to college for my 11 a.m. class. Took me 30 minutes to drive to school. I usually got up around 9:45 and left around 10:15. My mom called me shortly after 9 a.m. when the first plane hit. I then watched the news and saw the second plane hit as it aired. I went to school at 11 a.m., and they closed the campus at noon. Everyone was panicking and saying I should go straight home. I remember a good friend of mine on campus understood this was a significant event, but being in a suburb of Philadelphia, we didn't feel in danger. A little off topic, I remember the year before thinking about world peace and how we were really being civilized. Then 9/11 happened, and we have been in endless wars since. Story 74. I am realizing more and more that there is an entire generation that only knows this from history books and videos. In a way, I am happy for you, but for anyone who was present that day, they remember everything. I remember the sky. It was a vivid and bright blue, with no clouds and no haze. Just a perfect day. How's this for trivial? My wife and I were renovating our house, and that day happened to be when our designer and painter came, and I was to pick out color samples. What fun. We met at 8:30. A short time later, my phone rang. It was a friend telling me to turn on the news. Just that, and then they hung up. This was after the first plane had struck, so all the networks were scrambling, but none were in a panic. I kept the TV on, and we continued what we were doing until the second plane hit. We were all watching when it happened. We just looked at each other in disbelief. It took a minute or two to actually sink in. Needless to say, we stopped talking about paint, and it turned into 3 straight days of sitting in front of the TV. I even slept in front of the TV. I went out on September 12th and bought every edition of every international newspaper I could find. To watch it all unfold live and in real time is something I will never forget. Story 75. I was at work in Newark when I saw the second plane hit. I wasn't sure what I was witnessing in real time. I called my mother and said this must be what it feels like when we bomb innocent people. Story 76. Our reliable clock radio woke us up, just like any other workday in 2001. It was tuned to the local alternative FM radio station. Normally, we would get some nice wake-up music from artists like the White Stripes, Gorillaz, or Radiohead. Not that morning, though. We woke up to DJs who all sounded serious and alarmed about something. One of the first things I heard when coming out of sleep was, "There has been an attempted attack on the Pentagon." I shook my partner awake, and we listened for a minute. She ran to the TV while I went to the computer. None of the major news sites would load. They were all down. I kept refreshing pages in Internet Explorer, and occasionally, I would get a message with a major headline like, "Stand by." But that was it. On TV, we could see that the towers had been hit, but they were still standing. We watched as they both came down. Some co-workers of mine were on planes returning from Europe and were diverted to Canada for a few days. My sister's boyfriend at the time, a police officer with the New York Police Department, was one of the first responders on the scene and started having major lung problems in 2005. There are a few days that stand out in my mind in terms of, where were you when it happened? 1. September 11th, 2001. 2. The day the Challenger space shuttle exploded, 1986. 3. The day the Berlin Wall came down, 1989. 4. November 8th, 2016. Story 77. My son was a rookie police officer assigned to Harlem. He had just finished a midnight shift and was in bed. The bridges were closed except for police. He returned via the Triborough Bridge and stopped in the middle to take in the sight of the towers. A firefighter friend saw him there and also stopped. They were hoping that another firefighter friend assigned to the area was okay. Sadly, he is listed on the memorial. Story 78. I was in northern New Jersey, right across the river, and it was terrifying. We didn't know what was happening. Cell phones were down, and huge clouds of toxic smoke lingered over us for days. We were uncertain if more attacks were imminent. It was horrific. Story 79. I was in school in Florida, and everyone was coming to pick up their children early. The teachers were upset. My dad came home early from work. There was widespread panic, and no one knew if attacks would occur in multiple states. I lived in a populated area, so many people were concerned about it being a potential target. Disney closed early that day, which is rare for them. The entire country was in shock, and residents of populated cities were anxious about being next. It was a terrible situation. Story 80. Rob Riggle has a story about this that is quite extraordinary. My uncle was working in Somerset, Pennsylvania, and saw Flight 93 going down. Aware of what was happening, he watched it disappear over the hills moments before it impacted the ground. Story 81. It was terrible to watch people jump from windows. No one spoke. There were only gasps and cries. It was awful. I was in class when they brought in a television to watch it live. Story 82. I was in high school in England, and I always remember a random student saying, "They deserved it." Even as a teenager, it struck me as callous in that moment. Story 83. I saw it happening live on television in Australia. I worked under the Sydney Harbour Bridge, which would be a prime target, so for the next few days I was extremely anxious every time I saw a plane. Story 84. Unfortunately, I was off work that day. My husband called me to turn on the television. It was just after the second plane hit. Then the plane hit the Pentagon. No one knew how many planes were in the air and how many more targets there would be. It was unlike any other day. I watched CNN and CBS. When the first tower fell, they thought it was a bomb, not realizing the tower would collapse. What stuck with me most was the survivors walking aimlessly, covered in dirt. They were in shock and could hardly speak. Story 85. I was in college in Connecticut and had woken up early to study for a statistics quiz. As I was walking out the door, I checked an instant messaging away message that said, "Put on the TV. Just do it." I did, and it was right when the second plane hit. It was extremely upsetting, and all I could think was, there are people in there. Story 86. I was in 6th grade and somehow oblivious until the end of the day. I think most others were too. The only unusual thing that day was that we were told we couldn't go out for recess because of bees on the playground. Right before dismissal, the teacher calmly informed us that an incident had occurred in New York and advised us to discuss it with our parents at home. I'm not sure how I went the whole day without hearing anything, because a friend in another class mentioned that their class did a daily news activity by watching news broadcasts every morning, and they basically saw the event live. This friend also said the teacher never did the morning news activity again. Story 87. I was 20 years old and had just started my study abroad semester in Europe. I am from New York City, so this was the most surreal experience. It made me want to go home immediately, but of course that was impossible. Story 88. I was a senior in high school. I remember a cold chill running down my spine when the first plane hit the North Tower, followed by a feeling of dread when the second plane struck the South Tower. Then came the news of a plane hitting the Pentagon. The fear and uncertainty were palpable. A friend of mine had a father who worked at the Pentagon at the time. This was well before cell phones were widespread, and he had no way to reach his father. Fortunately, his father was in a section on the opposite side of the building. It is a day that carries many unpleasant memories. Story 89. I was working at a school in Queens. Over the public address system, the principal reported that there was a plane crash in Manhattan. The school opened office phones for students and staff to call family members. That was when everyone found out it was a terrorist attack. I cannot recall if the principal briefed teachers separately in groups. I vaguely remember that happening once during a bomb threat a long time ago. I found out what was really happening when I called my parents. As the news sunk in and preparations were made to get kids home, there was so much fear and heartbreaking sobbing emanating from the classrooms because many parents and guardians worked at Ground Zero. There was no way to get information from loved ones in Manhattan since cell phone service was down. People just didn't know and had to wait for hours for news. Fortunately, as far as I recall, none of the students' parents or guardians died. A relative of mine who lived in New Jersey and worked across the street bolted as soon as he heard the explosion. He knew this was not normal and needed to get out. He caught the last ferry before everything shut down. We heard from him fairly quickly. Others spent all day walking home from Manhattan to their borough with no way to contact their families. It was chaotic and frightening. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.